From the moment he announced his 2016 run for president, birther-in-chief Donald Trump has not been shy about showing us who he truly is, calling most Mexican migrants rapists and drug dealers at the beginning of his campaign, referring to white supremacists as very fine people. And now into his 2024 run, Trump appears to be diving in even deeper, if that's even possible. Just last week, he hosted a dinner at the Mar-A-Lago compound, and among those at his table, fellow 2024 candidate and musical artist Kanye West, who's been very outspoken with his anti-Semitic views these days. Also with him, white nationalist, Holocaust denier, fan of Putin and Hitler, Nick Fuentes. In response, after several days of silence on the subject, House Speaker-to-be Kevin McCarthy said publicly on Tuesday, Fuentes' ideology has no place in society, though he mistakenly asserted Trump condemned it as well. Then Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell followed up with a slightly stronger, there is no room in the Republican Party for anti-Semitism or white supremacy, but as usual, both stopped short of condemning Trump himself. And even as former Vice President Mike Pence said Trump should apologize, he added he didn't believe Trump was an anti-Semite. No, he just hosts dinners for them. I'm joined by Robert Trestan, Vice President of the Anti-Defamation League. Robert, it's good to see you.
Good to be here.
I'm almost embarrassed to ask this first question, but I gotta. What was your reaction when you first heard about this dinner?
I couldn't believe it. It was really shocking because regardless of what you, whether you agree or you voted for President Trump, he still carries the word president before his name. That's part of our history. And for him to be breaking bread with anti-Semites and a white, who are pushing forward an anti-Semitic agenda and white supremacy, it's just shocking. That is not what I expect. Forget about that I'm Jewish and anti-Semitism is important to me. It's not what I expect as an American of a former American president.
You don't expect it from this former American president?
No. It's below any sort of standard.
You know, you've been following and trying to eradicate hate for your whole career. Forget what you just said, or put it aside for the moment, the whole notion of what it looks like to have a former president hosting this kind of abomination. What's the trickle-down impact? Is it mainstream hate for people who are open to it? What's the impact on those kind of people?
Well, it's a consistent strategy that we've actually seen over the last several years.
Meaning what?
It empowers, it incites, and it inspires people to commit acts of violence, acts of hate. And, you know, President Trump may not intend that. It's possible that Ye doesn't either, and neither does Fuentes. But there is an impact, there's an outcome of their language, their behavior, and this coming together.
With all due respect, how can you say that he may not intend this? I mentioned birtherism. We know that African countries are shithole countries. We know that some Congress people of color should go back to the countries they came from. I mean, it's hard for almost anybody to say a former president's a racist. His behavior is that of a racist relentlessly, is it not?
Well, his actions are certainly questionable, but the main concern, to your question about what's the impact across the country, is that it inspires people. You know, look at some of the mass violence that we've seen in the last couple of weeks. So what happened in Colorado, keep in mind that the white supremacists who may be targeting Jews, who are targeting people of color, they hate people within the LGBTQ community just as much. Mm-hmm. They're not discriminating. And so, you know, there is a real life impact when people are inspired. And when they see this kind of gathering, the former president hosting people who have these views, it does give it credibility.
You know, almost every time I'm in a conversation with someone about the appalling behavior of Donald Trump, I step back and I say, what's even more upsetting to me than Trump's unconscionable behavior is that whole list I gave you a minute ago about things that Trump had done and said, and I could go on for an hour like this. People knew that when 74 million of them voted for him after he'd served for 4 years. What does it say that 74 million people, I would assume most of whom know at least one or two of these situations, seem willing to tolerate that in the leader of the free world?
It's pretty scary. but it also it's also a sign that we need more people to be standing up. So we see some people within the Republican Party starting to say something about this dinner. But the issue is not that it's not consistent. The ideology is not consistent with the Republican Party. It really is. It's not consistent with American politics. It's not consistent with governance in this country. We don't want to have extremists making policy for us.
So would it make a difference? I mean, Judy Woodruff at PBS sent her reporters out to talk to 57 Republicans the other day to get their reaction to this. Most of them didn't respond. Of those who responded, if I remember correctly, only Senator Cassidy from Louisiana and Mitt Romney, who's no big fan of Trump's to begin with, had the courage to say the name Trump in their criticism of this. If the GOP as a whole had the courage, and most of them do not, to stand up to this guy and his racism and his anti-Semitism, would that not have a beneficial effect on the thing you're concerned about, this people waiting for hate to be permissible and mainstreamed and that sort of thing? Wouldn't it help?
The key word is courage. And, when we watch some of the, if you think about what happened in Colorado, there were people who stood up in that just horrific moment. They exhibited courage. And if more people exhibited that courage, we might start to see a change here.
Speaking of change, one of the things that I fear that I fall into is I say to myself when I think about the worst of Trumpism, well, when Trump is gone, he either loses badly in this primary here, or he decides he doesn't want to run, or he loses to a Democrat in 2024. It ends with him, which I realize is incredibly naive. Yeah. This has been so embedded in America, in great part because of Trump. I'm not saying that's the sole reason. What's the antidote? I mean,
it's been mainstreamed. I mean, this is, what we see today has been building for years and years. This didn't just sort of happen.
Yeah, but it was elevated to an art form during Donald Trump and even post-presidency. He's there. So what is the fix for this, with or without Trump on the scene? What's the realistic fix?
I think it's a full court press on that we need to really we need to redefine who we are. And I think part of that comes within the American political structure. We don't want to have extremists within the military, within law enforcement. Mm-hmm. We have a perfect example of that here in Massachusetts, where a police officer was part of Charlottesville, which Nick Fuentes, by the way, was one of the people who was present.
There was a police officer from Boston. It was January 6th, his situation has still not been resolved almost 2 years later, by the way.
And then it goes all the way up to our leaders. And that's whether you're on the school committee, whether you're a member of a city council, or whether you're in Congress or in the White House.
So, and how do world leaders view a former leader who has an event like he had the other night at his palatial landing in Florida?
Well, we saw many examples of President Trump's interaction with world leaders, during his tenure as president. I think this may be a defining moment in the campaign, in the next 0 to 24 months.
Did you say that same thing when he got off the bus and was talking about women's genitals, or when he talked about McCain or Khizr Khan, or didn't you say those same things then? He seems to be pretty immune.
Well, we know. Well, the country's in a different place now than it was then, and we've also experienced many other different things. So I'm not sure it's a fair. I'm not sure it's a fair comparison, because things are changing dramatically all the time, and we need to be monitoring those changes and reacting accordingly.
One more thing before you go, Robert. Talk about courage. I meant to mention this before, but I forgot. A lot of conservative Jewish groups have chosen for maybe 6 years now to ignore the worst of Trump, as long as he was steadfast in his support of Israel. That wall seems to be breaking a little bit since Mar-a-Lago. Am I being overly optimistic?
After this dinner, I think you saw across the spectrum, including many Republican Jews who've been supportive of him, were highly critical of him, and many organizations. I think there was an across-the-board recognition that this crossed the line, but it didn't just cross the line. Is dangerous.
And do you think the American people have had enough of this kind of behavior? And I'm not talking, I mean, I mentioned the 74 million who voted for it, but as a whole, on my rare optimistic moments, I seem to think that even they have had enough, not just of this, but of crap from people like Lauren Boebert talking about drag queens not coming to her district, and then, of course, professing great sympathy for the 5 people murdered at Club Q. Are we finally saying we've had enough of this?
I think Americans are sick and tired of the hate violence and people losing their lives because of who they are. And it's directly connected. And so whatever it takes, we need to come together as a country and define who we want to be, because this is not who we are as Americans. And we need to change that.
I hope you're right, Robert. Thank you so much. It's good to see you. Appreciate it a lot, Robert Trestan.